Good afternoon, everybody, or bon après-midi, as we say in France. I'm so glad to welcome Betty back to the Poison Pen, and we hold it up. This is my advanced reading copy with her new book, Lost in Paris, which is setting Betty on a whole new voyage, isn't it?
Really different, really different. Can you hear me on this? Is this working? No. Okay. Not only do I have a totally different location of the book, but I also have, for the first time, I've written in the third voice. So that's going to be interesting for those of you who are used to hearing Lena Jones think and Teddy think. You're not going to see a lot of, or hear a lot of Zoe's voice. So, but that's okay. Don't worry about it.
Well, she needs to do that for other purposes. You know what? I'm not sure your mic's working, and I don't need one, so here.
Oh,
that's right. I have a louder voice, so no one will care if they can't hear me anyway, so I hear, so it'll be fine. So this journey, if I remember it, began when you actually went to Paris.
Yeah, Paul and I got married on May the 1st, and we thought we would spend another couple of weeks in Paris to celebrate. And while we were just kind of wandering around, you know how you do in Paris, things started clicking. And I remembered something about a party that I'd attended long, long ago. When we're talking about long, long ago, I think it was either the 70s or the 80s. Now it was the 70s, I remember. I was at a party, and one of the games was, if you could live anywhere at any time, where would you pick? And I immediately said, Paris, 1922. And people were saying things like, I would live in heaven for eternity, but not me. I wanted to live in Paris, 1922, where the liquor flowed, and people just did dastardly things, and they had a lot of fun. So when we were walking down the street, one of the first things I ran into was a flea market. And that flea market, it stretched for blocks. And I thought, wonder if anybody's ever written a mystery about a flea market in Paris. Actually, I did. That's going to be the follow-up to Lost in Paris. But in Lost in Paris, we have something from my childhood. Zoe, our protagonist, was raised in Alabama. And so we're talking being raised in Alabama at the turn of the century. And this was before the Civil Rights Movement started. She fell in love with a black man, and she had his baby. They were married according to the custom of that day. She had a baby, and then he was killed in World War I. And because she had a mixed-race baby, her parents, well, not her parents, both her parents were dead by then. She was thrown out of her house. She was a debutante, but it didn't matter. She sinned, that's how they saw it, and wound up in Paris, where she became an artist. But she always wondered what happened to that baby that was taken away from her the night it was born, little girl. And so during the series, this is going to be a series again, I can't help myself, she will be looking for that little girl. But in the meantime, because of the people she hangs out with, she gets mixed up in a murder case. And now here, one of the fun things about this particular series is so much is based on reality, what really happened. How many of you know that Ernest Hemingway had his first works stolen off the train? Good for you. Then you will find out what happened to them in this book. I solved the crime. Or rather, Zoe solved the crime. And for those of you who didn't know, Ernest Hemingway was covering, he wasn't published in fiction yet. Well, no, a few short stories, but that was it. And he was sent north to Switzerland to cover the treaty and the peace talks, leaving all his work back in his Paris apartment. But when he was in Lausanne, Switzerland, covering the peace talks, he ran into a publisher, and the publisher said, gee, I would be interested in seeing your work. So he called his wife, Hadley. Those of you who have read The Paris Wife, you'll know what happened. He called Hadley and said, you need to bring copies of my work so I can show them to this publisher. Maybe I'll get them published. He had the entire manuscript of his very first novel in there. And she was suffering from Spanish flu, and her brain was not right. So she took every single thing he had written, including the carbon copies, put them in a valise, and took off for the train station. She got to the train. Now, we've got to remember, this poor woman had the Spanish flu. She wasn't right in the head. So she put the valise with all of Hemingway's manuscripts under her seat of the train. And then she was beginning to feel bad again, and she knew she would have to have a lot of water. So she left the train car, went back out onto the platform, bought herself some water, ran into some friends. They talked, and they talked. And then she said, you know, trains in those days, when you had to board, they go, woo, woo. Well, when she heard the woo, woo, she ran back to her car, and the valise was gone. All of Hemingway's work, gone, vamoose, scattered to the winds. So that's what entraps her into the first case of Zoe's life. What happened? Who stole Hemingway's manuscript? Now, I will say, she did find them, but that's all I'm going to tell you. There were a lot of deaths on the way to finding those stolen manuscripts. I think it's the highest death count I've ever had in any of my books, including Lena Jones. I mean, there we were. We're thinking that, oh, look, we've got a sweet little cozy set in Paris. No, it was a slaughterhouse.
Right, so in real life, nobody ever has found the papers. And my guess is that somebody stole it for the police because it had value and they probably just discarded. You know, because nobody knew who Hemingway was. There wasn't any reason for anyone to think that the papers were valuable. And if you read The Paris Wife, and if you haven't, I really recommend it. He never got over that. Hadley and he split up, and off he went on his, you know, serial marriage and all. And, you know, and he came from a family of depressives and suicides, and eventually, as you may remember, he actually shot himself with his fourth wife, I think, somewhere nearby. Anyway, you know, but I can understand that it would have been an unforgivable.
It was.
You know, he just couldn't get over it, and you know, I can't say that I would blame him. So it was one of those things that was nobody's fault. Well, it was actually, but you know, you have to sort of exonerate her as well.
Yeah, she was sick. That's the official excuse. She was sick, and I think she actually really was. But I think there was also something else going on there. You've heard of passive aggressive. He was already making her life hell, and so who knows? Maybe she was passive aggressive and kind of lost them on purpose, or maybe she really was so sick she didn't know what she was doing. Anyway.
I'm going to give her the benefit of a doubt. I just don't really think that, you know, that's a very strange way to sabotage somebody. You know, but, you know, it's possible. But it doesn't matter because we're never going to know.
But if you're a writer, it's a great way
to
sabotage.
True. Absolutely true. So Betty and I started talking about this book. How many years ago was it?
I think it was 4 years ago, maybe 5.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you wrote a first draft before we sold Poison Pen Press, so I'm the original editor on this book. And there's a, you know, Paris in the 1920s was absolutely crowded with creative people. There were writers, there were painters, there were, you know, poets, and it was a reaction to World War I. The Roaring Twenties was in part because people, it's kind of like what they call revenge travel right now, you know, where everybody was so bottled up that they're out doing things, and it was the same thing in the 20s. But the French, because of their colonization in the West Indies, had a much different attitude towards race and interracial marriage and interracial children and so forth than people. You threw on your Alabama roots for this one, didn't you?
Boy, did I ever. And I think I've made all my cousins really mad. So, well, let's see.
Well, anyway, it would not have been unusual to have a mixed race couple in Paris in the 1920s. But unfortunately for Zoe, the person she fell in love with in Alabama, there wasn't that kind of free thinking, shall we call it, for that time.
Right,
Anyway,
yeah.
right. And so she did become pregnant, and he went off to war, where he died.
Yeah,
And there she was.
He was with the Harlem Hellfighters, and they broke records during World War I of how well they managed with second-hand weapons half the time. But the French, he wound up, her husband wound up fighting with the French because the Americans still were not comfortable with the idea of black people fighting alongside white people. I mean, it's hard to explain because it's just so strange. You know, we've changed so much. But he died, a hero, and then she was left all alone, looking for her baby, grieving over her husband, who she deeply loved. He was a musician, by the way, before the war. And at the same time, though, with Paris being Paris, she had, well, let's put it this way. The house that she wound up in had a mirror over the bedroom ceiling. So she used that several times. And she had a love life, which I'm not going to describe at this time, but the mirror came in handy, let's put it that way.
Right. So what happened is her Alabama family, when she had the baby, took the baby away and dumped her in Paris.
Yeah.
But they did give her some funds to live on.
Yeah, she was, let's see, what did we call it when the British sent their ne'er-do-well sons over to America?
They were remittance men.
It was
Remittance.
remittance man, yeah. So she was a remittance woman, but she didn't make enough from that to live high on hog, as we say in Alabama. So she started holding poker parties at her house, and she turned out to be a very good poker player. And so this let her rise a little bit in society. So aristocrats started turning up for her poker games. Murderers turned up for her poker games. Innocent people turned up for her poker games. It was a lot of fun, and for that, I have to thank my father. My father was a professional gambler. He owned 2 casinos in Nevada. I'm sorry, not Nevada. He owned 2 casinos in southern Illinois. And you're going to say to me, I didn't know it was legal in Illinois. No, it wasn't. It wasn't in Illinois. So there's a lot of knowledge I gained from my father that's in this book. So it's very close to me.
Actually, we had a very nice couple and their son who came to an event recently. And as one does when you're just making conversation with people you just met, I asked the son what he did for a living. Oh, he said, I'm a professional gambler. So I sort of reeled back. And then, he pointed out that sports betting has now become, you can be a professional gambler in that field. So, supporting yourself through poker.
That's
there were
right.
plenty of people. There's a Georgette Hare book, in fact, called Pharaoh's Daughter, a Regency romance, which is wonderful. And Pharaoh was a game.
Yeah.
That,
Well, my mother actually worked for my dad before they got married. She worked at one of his casinos. And I happen to know that when she moved north later on, my dad got divorced when I was 3, that there were rumors that my mother had a floating poker game in Detroit, Michigan. Just rumors.
Sounds like Guys and Dolls, doesn't it? The oldest established permanent floating crap game in New York. This is my very favorite sounds from
So are
Guys
you a
and Dolls.
good poker player?
I used to be a pretty, I was a fairly good poker player for a kid, but my father did me damage in a certain way. He taught me how to count. Ace, 2, 3, tray, 4, 5. so that let's put it this way, I wound up being bullied in school because of the way I counted. But I also learned, in my case, the bullying was good because I learned how to fight. So, there's something very different also about Zoe, besides her life, the way she's living, is one morning, and I'm in the middle of writing the book, right? I get up and I had slept the wrong way, and my entire left leg was numb. So I'm headed for the kitchen, dragging my left leg to make my coffee. Halfway there, I'm thinking, I wonder if Zoe has a bad leg. And I went back to the desk, and yep, Zoe has one leg that is 2 inches shorter than the other leg.
Oh.
And I'm able to show the kind of grit she has, because those of you who have been to Paris know that most of these buildings, the flats, are several stories high. 6 and 7 are the usual. And they don't all have elevators at that time. So she has a lot of trouble actually climbing stairs to get to a suspect that she wants to interview, to find out who possibly stole the manuscript.
So, were there cobblestones still on the streets?
Yeah, there were still cobblestones.
So those are really wicked,
Yeah, bad. But it changed her. I liked Zoe going into that first draft, but once I gave her that childhood accident, she'd fallen from a tree. She was a tomboy. Suddenly, it was like there was a life force there that hadn't been there earlier. So, and there's one other weird thing that happened while I was writing it. I don't know how many of you know this, a couple do, that I worked as a writer in residence with some different libraries here. And so I was at the library, this time it was Tempe, and my little office was glass windows around, but I had a nice private place to work and to see my students. Well, I'm sitting there one time marking off some of my students' essays, and I look up. Now this is going to sound weird, this is going to sound woo-woo, but this is what happened. I look up and I see the word spider in green, day-glow green, floating in the air. And I'm thinking, spider. Well, why am I thinking about spiders? I have no argument with spiders. Spiders and me were tight. We're fine. But I'm trying to figure out why I saw the word spider and it was green. So I went down to the children's section and I looked through the children's books on spiders. Kids like spiders. And I saw this little green spider who was the size of my little fingernail. And it's called a huntsman spider because they're non-poisonous. They disguise themselves on a blade of grass, and then when prey walks by, like an aphid, they reach out and chomp on the aphid. So I thought, wow, maybe I should put a green spider in my book. And I thought, that makes no sense. But then I realized I had already created a character who is the wife of the police inspector who has an affair with Zoe. The wife has had a serious stroke and she's bedridden and can't even speak. And I thought, well, if I make the wife a botanist, she'll have a lot of plants in her room and she'll have paintings of plants on the walls. And I'm still in this glassed-in enclosure in the Tempe Library trying to figure out how I could get this spider in the book. And I finally figured it out. The Gabrielle, who is the police inspector's wife, ailing wife, is alone, and she feels helpless and very much alone. But one morning she wakes up and a little green spider has climbed up to her shoulder and says, Madame, how are you doing this fine day? Yes, it's a talking spider. And what can I say? It's a talking spider named Odile. And I grew to love this spider. So the spider is actually a major part of the book. A talking spider.
It's fiction. Why not?
It's fiction. Why not?
So one of the, as I mentioned earlier, one of the great things about Paris in the 20s was the huge number of creative people. So Zoe has the chance to meet and interact with many real life people.
Oh man.
So you really had a great time with that, didn't you?
It was, well, you know, I went to art school, not college, which explains a lot of gaps in my knowledge. But I can paint, oh boy, can I paint. I can't multiply, I can't add. I know a little bit, almost nothing about world history, except for Paris. And that's because I went to art school. So I drug out everything I knew that I learned in art school. I had Picasso there, I had Matisse, Salvador Dali. They're all in these books, and they come. Some of them play poker with Zoe.
Well, you even sidelined Mary Cassatt, pointing out that she's too old and is never going to do more work. And then Zoe has a great line. I think I might have marked it because I really like that. Maybe I did.
Now, Mary Cassatt, you know, was the American painter, but
Right.
she lived in Paris. She lived in France.
So, village's only worthwhile inhabitant is Mary Cassatt, another American. Turning back to Zoe, wherever this is said, is that its attraction, an old lady who can't paint anymore? Zoe wanted to tell Kiki that Cassat's work would survive when the rest of them were food for worms. Which is true, actually. But, you know, I mean, one of the interesting things about artists and art is that you never know what's going to happen in the future, that people who are popular at the moment can fall away, and people who's, well, Van Gogh is an excellent idea. You know, you couldn't give away his paintings, and today, one of the most high-priced artists in the world.
Yes.
So, and that's true with music, it's true with a lot of things, where sometimes creative people labor their whole lives and never really get any recognition. And then, but so, if we're looking back 100 years later, you know, it's easy for us to say, well, dummy, you know, you should have known Mary Cassatt was gonna, you know, but it doesn't work that way. Not at the time. But I figured that you actually had the most fun with all the people that she met.
Oh yeah, Hemingway. Let's start with Hemingway. He is one of her semi-friends. She's actually more friendly with Hemingway's life, but there is Hemingway the writer, and I all but worship Hemingway the writer. Beautiful stuff. When I'm teaching creative writing, the first thing I do is tell my students, read Hemingway. And so, but that's Hemingway the writer. There is Hemingway. I'm trying to think of a polite word.
There's a number of S words that come to mind.
Oh, here's one. He was really a crappy guy. That's the polite word for what I could have used, but
That's true.
yeah. There's also one thing. I don't know if you noticed who it's dedicated to. Now, I've dedicated a lot of my books to my husband, of course. That's Paul with the hat in the back. But this one, it says to let me see the. Because there's a great story on this.
Is there? There's a lot of material up in
I know.
here. Trying to tell me what I should think about your book. Great. Eventually we'll get there. There we are.
Okay.
Here you go.
I'll read you the dedication. For Laurent Teichmann, whose loan of a certain book made all the difference. Now, I was floundering around quite a bit in the book because there are all these famous people. There's Zoe with this tragic past. And I did not know really what the tone of the book should be. And I was talking about it to my hairdresser, who is French. And not French derivative. He lived in Paris. So I was telling him the trouble I was having. I said, you know, it's right now it's like a parade of famous people, and that's not really a great book. He said, well, you need to think about what the average person was like, or maybe a model, because all of those painters had models. He says, I'll bring you a book, and you can read it. And so the next time you come in. So the next time I came in, there was the book, and it's called Kiki of Montparnasse.
Right, she was Man Ray's lover, right?
Yeah, she was Man Ray's lover. Kiki was the model, the nude model that most of the painters used, but she was also a painter herself. And I read this book from cover to cover. It was like incredible. And so one of the major characters now in the book is Kiki. And the tone came from reading this book about Kiki and the troubles she had and the wonders she had. And I told Laurent, I said, without that book you gave me, it would have been a different book and not half as good. Because Kiki, boy, she was a wild woman. Just a wild, very beautiful, but a wild woman. And since Zoe was not actually wild, she was just kind of semi-feral. But Kiki was feral. She was just wild as she could be. And she died young, which is sad, but she left her mark. So I wound up dedicating a book to my who is not charging me for my haircuts anymore.
I love it. Bribed with a book. That's a wonderful story. You know, it's true that oftentimes there are people whose lives are so astonishing that you couldn't make them up. There's actually stuff happening every day today that you couldn't make up. You know, I have a thriller writer currently staying with me, and after reading the paper today, she said, you know, I couldn't make this up. I just couldn't do it. You know, so, but nonetheless, one of the things about historical fiction is it does give you a lens. You know, so it's one thing to be writing about current events and trying to keep up, but the lens of history is such that things that you wouldn't have necessarily known or realized at the time are now clear. And so you have that advantage when you're looking back. I mean, Dundas writes wonderful historical fiction, but don't you think that that's true? That, you know, you could write about farming in Oklahoma at the time that you're writing about in a way that you could never have done it at the time it was happening.
Oh, absolutely. Well, actually, you can use historical fiction to really comment on what's going on without offending people.
That's true.
Because, you know, people never learn. They just keep doing the same thing over and over again.
They do.
I know. I think that often about Putin and invading the Ukraine, and I had an interesting conversation with some military for some weird reason. I mean, here I am, an 82-year-old, you know, very nice grandma, and we are the epicenter of military fiction in the United States at the moment. They all come here, and, you know, why me? It's a really interesting question. I haven't figured it out. But in talking to a couple of them, I said to them, you know, didn't he pay any attention to Hitler? And then I said, didn't Hitler pay any attention to Napoleon? 3 times, you know, and they said a really interesting thing. Because my question was, what did Napoleon think he would do with Russia if he conquered it? Was he really going to govern it from Paris? And you can ask the same question about Vietnam and Afghanistan. What were we going to do if we actually conquered it? What were we going to do with it? Because he'd have to govern it, right? And govern it from a distance. But anyway, their comment was, which I thought was really interesting. He said, if you're Russian, and particularly if you're a Russian of Putin's generation, it's not about winning. It's about making the other side lose. There's no win-win in that equation for them. As long as you lose something, they won. And I thought that's such an interesting, you know, way of looking at it. And maybe that does explain Napoleon, or, you know, maybe that was the idea. It was just
just to win.
But when you really think that, a person that Hitler would have looked at what happened for Napoleon and thought, it's not a good idea. Really not a good idea to go to Russia in the winter.
I think they all always think, oh, it'll be different with me because I'm smarter than that guy.
Yeah, but never mind.
Yeah.
The supply line was never going to flourish
Yeah.
under those conditions. But anyway, so you do have the advantage of an historical lens. Looking at these characters, you know that Mary Cassatt is valued than some of the other authors were.
Yeah.
You know that Hemingway, despite this terrible loss of his
Yeah.
work, went on to have,
Yeah.
a writing career.
Yeah.
And we know that too. So as readers, we bring that knowledge to the book as well, don't we? So, I think the challenge in historical fiction is creating surprise because you're dealing with knowns
Yeah.
and you have to create unknowns in order to make it suspenseful.
One of the things I did when my friend Zoe found her first corpse, I made it look like, and Zoe thought this, and some of the other people thought this once the body was found, was it Anastasia? Because, don't forget, the Russian Revolution happened during the First World War. So, for many, many years, people thought Anastasia still lived. I mean, we now have DNA proof that she is dead and was buried over there. But, so at first, Zoe thinks she might have found the corpse of Anastasia, which is the Grand Duchess of Russia. So that's another thing that was happening at that time. And this is so much fun. I could have spent more time on it, but I knew I had to have a mystery with a forward motion. But Paris had become the landing zone for all of the Russian aristocrats that fled from the communist revolution. But a lot of the communists were in Paris too. And one of my favorite passages in the book, one of my favorite chapters, was when Zoe is having her breakfast, a very refined breakfast of a croissant and cafe, whatever, and there's a table full of communists on one side, a table full of Russian aristocrats, and they get in a big brawl, slinging wine and glasses and all kinds. So that was going on, all this political unrest, and that would have been so easy to get down the rabbit hole with that one because, gosh, Freud was there. I mean, everybody was there.
Yeah, well, but there was a lot of Russian artists going on at the same time. I mean, you had Diaghilev and you had Stravinsky and you had all kinds of stuff happening.
Right.
And so ballet russe was going strong.
Yeah.
But you're right, that is where they tended to end up. Today it's London, as we all know.
Yeah.
Today, the rich Russians end up in London, but then it was Paris.
Well, another thing I learned while I was doing the research, now this informs the next book in the series, is that Marc Chagall, who went back to Russia, well, he was living in Paris, but he went back to Russia to marry his fiancée. While he was in Russia, the World War I started. So he couldn't get back to Paris. He had left almost 300 paintings. There were 150 of them in Berlin that were ready for a show, and then there were about 150 in Paris. They vanished. And that's what the next book is about, which has a title I absolutely hate, but it's called The Clock Struck Murder. I wanted to be found in Paris because Zoe finds some of the old work. But, and not only was a lot of his work lost, but one person took a beautiful painting of his. Now, oil paint, resists water. And she had a rabbit hutch in the back of her house. So she took this oil painting by Marc Chagall and used it as a roof for the rabbit hutch. Yeah, I can hardly stand it.
I can hear tears in your voice right there. I know.
Yeah.
Zoe
rescues it. Zoe rescues it.
Yeah, but there again, that's that lens, you know,
Yeah.
because she didn't think it was worth anything, and it turns out that,
Yeah.
that it actually was. So it seems to me that what you're going to be writing a series that, and I don't know the answer to this, so I'm just guessing, but Zoe is going to be on a perpetual quest for her missing daughter,
Yeah, she is.
whom she calls the Amber Child.
Yeah, because when the baby was born, it was an amber color because it was half white and half. Well, the father was also mixed race. So, but in her mind, she sees that girl's. It is a girl. She knows that much, and the name is Amber, and that's there. I will say, in the second or third book, there is something very sweet that happens. So it's not all a murder. It's not all mirrored bedroom ceilings. There's also sweetness.
Death and sex and sweetness, right? So, questions from the audience. Oh, yes, Pat, you got one coming?
Yeah, Lynn from one of our online audience members asked, she says she was fortunate enough to read an arc of the book. And she said that Russian immigration after the revolution is a significant part of your book. How were the common people from Russia viewed by the Parisians?
Oh, it's dirt. You know, the Parisians are a little snobby, and I'm not going to say that's nice, but they didn't do well. They didn't do well. But the aristocrats, if they got out with gold and jewels, they were welcomed with open arms.
Because of the beautiful cover here, is Zoe, was she an artist before she went, or did she?
Actually, yes, she was, because I do have a couple of flashbacks which showed her out in the field drawing some of the animals, which, by the way, I did when I was a child. So there's a lot of me in Zoe. And she knew she wanted to be an artist. And so but she had a grandmother who was French. So they took her, her brother took her to dump on the grandmother in France. But turns out the grandmother was killed in World War I. So she was there without any. And then she got kind of adopted by a certain group of...
So she's pursuing her?
Yeah, that's her. She's painting. And she gets more and more well known as the series continues. Yeah. So there's sweetness there too.
How unusual for you.
I know. I was pretty sweet with the Zoom mysteries.
You were. You got all that dark out with Lena. Right, absolutely. Anybody else have a question?
Actually, I had a comment from the online audience. And you are new to a couple people here who just happened to watch because Poison Pen is sending something out on Facebook. And one person asked, well, what's next? Since you're new to quite a few of our online audience members, can you also tell us what was previous?
Well, there's the previous, I have two different series besides my French series. The first one is the Lena Jones Desert series, which starts off with Desert Noir and follows with Desert Wives, which is about polygamy in Arizona. And that was probably my most famous book because it started a sea change of how polygamy is treated here in Arizona. It's not the sweet little religious thing with women wearing prairie dresses that the polygamists would have us believe. So
actually, that was one of my most favorite things I ever did as an editor with Poison Pen Press, was to write to our governor, who was the friend, and say, Janet, Penny's written this book, and I think you might want to read it now so you'll know which side of this issue you want to come in on. Because when Arizona did try to enforce polygamy laws, the governor lost his job. He was thrown out of office for it. It was a real mess. And Betty's book actually is responsible in part for the fact that both Arizona and Utah got tough on the polygamists, because what they did is they would live right by the border, and whenever Arizona would show up, they'd step over into Utah. And whenever Utah would show up, they'd step back into Arizona, and nobody could resolve the jurisdictional thing. What Betty does in that book is she creates a federal crime, which is that they took funds for what child welfare money and misused it, and therefore the federal government didn't have a problem with people stepping back and forth over the state line, and that's what they used to take down Jeff, whatever his name is. So Betty actually, because she was, a reporter and a journalist here for years, Betty's book really sparked, just not exactly Uncle Tom's Cabin, but sort of like that. Really did some good work.
Yeah. So there was the Desert series, and in each one of the Desert series were crimes that I happened to know about for one reason or another. So they were set on the truth. But then after that, I got tired of being mean all of the time. There's a lot of meanness in the Lena Jones Desert series because she's one tough cookie. Carries a gun. I mean, Arizona loves her. But anyway, I did decide that I wanted to be a little more mellow, be sweet. What had happened actually was that I had retired from the newspaper, from the Tribune, and I didn't have anything to get real mad about for a while. But working for a newspaper will make you mad as hell, and you're not going to take it anymore, as the movie says. So what I did was I decided I would go ahead and volunteer at the Phoenix Zoo because I was a farm kid. Yeah. And I wanted to be around animals other than my 5 cats and my dog. So I started volunteering at Phoenix Zoo, and one day I was having my lunch and I was watching the giant anteater play with her baby. They were playing chase, run back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And I said out loud to another friend of mine who was a volunteer, I said, "That is so cute. Somebody needs to be writing a book about that." And she said, "You're a writer. Write it yourself." So I said, oh, okay. And I did. So that wound up being the Gun Zoo Mysteries. The first book in that series was the Anteater of Death. The second book, well, I can't remember the series in order, but there was also the Otter of Death. We all know how vicious otters are. Let's see what. Oh, the Llama of Death. Oh, the Llama of Death was so much fun because the llamas spit when they're mad. So I had a lot of fun with that one.
There's the Otter of Death and the Puffin of Death.
The Puffin of Death. Oh, the Puffin of Death, which takes place in Iceland. And this is a terrible story to tell on myself, but I'm going to tell it anyway. We did talk about the federal government, so anyway. I came into to Poison Pen bookstore, and I was looking for something to read. It was the summer, and you know what it's like here. So I thought, I'll find a book that's written about Alaska, say. So I'm going through the books, and I see one that's set in Iceland. I said, yeah, Iceland, that's it. So I take it home, and I'm reading this book set in Iceland. And I wanted to go. Paul was already in bed asleep, and I ran in and said, "We're going to Iceland." So I went to Iceland, and then while I was in Iceland, I thought, now how can I have this written off on my taxes? Thus, the Puffin of Death, set in Iceland.
And you had a lot of fun with that too.
I sure did.
There's a polar bear that has a starring role.
Yeah, baby polar bear.
They are not cozy mysteries in the sense that Betty still can't resist some hard-hitting plotting.
Yes,
and I
that's
thought
true.
particularly the last one. Is the last one? Wasn't the Puffin? There's one more after that.
Panda.
Oh yeah, the Panda of Death.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I thought that one had an absolutely terrific plot, and again, it was based to some degree on the Me Too movement, but before the Me Too thing really got going.
Yeah.
So it's almost a prescient book, and it's interesting that authors who write crime fiction are said very often to be writing right along the edge of social change. because that's where conflict is, and if you're writing a mystery or a thriller, you need conflict in order to make it all happen. And it's surprising how many thrillers particularly, but crime fiction in general, almost precedes whatever's happening in society or reflects it. I find it fascinating, so Betty in that book, which is I think one of her very best plots, right there, right just before the whole Harvey Weinstein thing.
Yep.
There it was. So I've given you a clue about what happened in the book, so I'm sorry about that. But I do find that that's a really interesting thing. It's almost like you guys are sort of like sniffing the air,
I think that's true, because we notice stuff before the average person does. It's almost like a scent in the air, and we've got our nose up going.
Yeah, but you're looking for conflict. I mean,
And
most
that's
people
true.
are not
That's
looking
true.
for conflict. Most of us are sort of going along hoping nothing terrible will happen. And instead, you're looking for danger and conflict and all the
That's
rest
true.
of it. It's
That's true.
very interesting. Anyway, those are Betty's two series. The Lena Jones series was designed to be 10 books long, and it followed an arc for Lena of discovering some of her own life, her own history.
Lena Jones was a foster child, and she had gone through several different foster families. What had happened was she was found on the street here in Arizona, on Thomas Road in Scottsdale, with a bullet in her head, and she was 4 years old when that happened, and she had recurring problems with anger and other things as she grew up. And I base that partially on a childhood friend of mine who was a foster child. And we went to the same middle school and the same high school together. And she would tell me all of these different things, and I thought, wow. So I just realized in that book, she's searching for her parents. Oh my gosh. Lena Jones is searching for her parents, and Zoe is searching for her baby. I just figured that out.
And even Teddy is actually searching for approval from her mother and her grandmother. So there's a constant quest thing going on there. Right. So the Gunsu mysteries actually could continue.
Yeah, they could.
They don't need to stop. Lena was done. It was designed. Are any of you watching Ted Lasso?
Oh, yes.
Well, it's designed to be just 3 seasons, and the guy's already under pressure, but he has said, no, he said, I wrote it to be 3 seasons, and, it won't be the same. I'll be interested to see if he caves in to pressure to continue it, or if he sticks to. That's the story. That's a 3-act story.
Yeah.
And that's hard to do, but, you did do that with Lena. You were always going to write 10 books.
Right. I knew exactly what was going to happen and when it would happen, and it would happen on the 10th book. And you talk about one of the readers that come here all the time actually said to me, she said, that last sentence in the 10th Lena Jones book was the best ending ever of any series I've ever read. I won't tell you what it is.
No. Anybody else have a question? That was a great question, by the way, PK. Thank you for bringing it up. Or maybe it wasn't a question, maybe it was just you.
It was just, comments from the audience and
Right, well, it was very well done. Anybody else? Yes.
So you're on the 3rd Paris book right now?
Yeah, 3rd Paris book.
Okay, finished the second and you're
The
working
second,
on the
I
third?
turned the second in last Monday, I think it was.
Okay.
And I would remember when I started talking about my trip to Paris, May 1st. When I saw all of these flea markets.
Mm-hmm.
A flea market is very much in the book. In fact, that's I can't say that much.
Don't say that much.
Oh, Chagall's lost work is in that book.
Okay.
Not a happy ending there, because he never did get all of his paintings back. He got some back, but not all.
Do you know how many books that will be, that series? This series,
No,
or are you still
no.
deciding?
What's happening now with a lot of publishers, and this is true of mine, they're giving you a contract for 2 books, Then when you finish those 2 books, they'll give you another two book contract, and it can go forever or it can stop. It just depends on how well the books perform, which is another word for sold. So,
Right. So it does put some pressure on the end book in a 2-book contract to leave it in a place where if that's
Right,
it,
if that's
it
it,
won't
then
be
it's
terrible.
okay.
Yeah, and that's a lot of pressure, you
It
know, I
is.
think,
so
on a writer.
yeah, so I have to write each book as if it would be the last book in the series. So no cliffhangers, although there is an unknown cliffhanger in this book, and I'm not going to tell you what.
How
it is.
about the Olympics?
Oh, no, that's true. When I was coming up with the idea for the flea market murders, I was, you know how you first start off, you go on to Google and you do the timeline like Paris 1924, which is when the next book takes place. So I'm typing merrily away, what happened in Paris 1924? Guess what? They were holding the Summer Olympics in Paris of 1924. So Johnny Weissmuller, who won 3 gold medals in that
Tarzan lives.
yeah, Tarzan. So he's in the book. And along with the usual artists, writers, and musicians, so Tarzan's in the book, but this is long before Tarzan, actually. Weissmuller was there. Talk about going down the rabbit hole. Oh, I don't care for sports. If that baseball stadium was on my block, I wouldn't go. I just don't like sports, except horseback riding if it's me with the horse, yeah. But I got so down the rabbit hole with all of those different athletes. I learned that there was an almost blind jumper. What do they call them when you have the long stick and you go
Pole
vaulting?
vaulting.
Yeah,
Vaulting.
pole vaulting. See,
Wow.
see how much I know about sports? I can't even remember how many people are on a baseball team or
Right.
football, okay, or basketball. News to me. But as long as I stuck with the research, I was okay. So yeah, in fact, in that second book, all of Zoe's friends and Zoe's are all bitching about the crowds of tourists. From page 1 to the last page, bitch, bitch, bitch. People here. So yeah, and I was going to set the 3rd book in 1926, but I found out that something happened big time, well, for me big time, in Paris in 1925. So the 3rd book will be in 1925.
Well, you don't want to write your way out of the 20s. The 30s are entirely different.
That's right. I am not.
Stick to the 20s.
I am sticking to the 20s because once 1930 ran around, they got bad. I don't want to do that.
No, it would totally change
Yeah,
the
yeah.
tone of it, right? Anyone else? Well, in that case, let me thank you all very much for coming. Let's give Betty a round of applause.